Broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota. My name is Shaun, and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Today, my special guest is Constantine Campbell, and we're talking about his new book, Advances in the Study of Greek, New Insights for Reading the New Testament, which is published by our friends over at Zondervan Academic. Con, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shaun. Thanks for having me.
Well, first off, I think it'd be helpful just to give the audience a chance to get to know you a little bit better. I would love to hear a bit about your background and, bring us up to date on your current position over there at Trinity.
Sure. Well, I am Australian born and raised and lived there my whole life until just over 2 years ago. I became a Christian at university, and one thing led to another. I ended up studying at Moore Theological College, and then after a few years of pastoring, taught there for the last 7.5 years. And then for the last 2 and a bit years, I've been on the faculty at Trinity in Illinois. So that's a little bit about me, yeah.
How was it that you got connected with Greek? Is that something that you had an interest in your undergrad days, or is that something that developed over time?
That really developed while I was a student at Moore College. I'm actually half Greek, and my mother used to say this was me returning to my roots. I never really saw it that way. I just had a thing for the languages, Greek and Hebrew. But ultimately, I was interested in Greek for the sake of studying New Testament text. And Greek exegesis is really what I am primarily concerned with. But I was good at the languages and kind of did an honors thesis on Greek verbal aspect, and actually it was on the pluperfect tense form. And completing that and finishing my studies at Moore, that led to a PhD study on verbal aspect. I realized from my honors thesis there was a lot more that I wanted to do and wanted to explore. That study was done through Macquarie University under the supervision of Trevor Evans, who himself is a significant contributor to the aspect in ancient Greek discussion. So, yeah, Greek kind of developed along those lines, and, I've been working in that area ever since, but always with a view to exegesis, and that's helping people read the scriptures well and teach them well.
You share this story in the book, and I'd love for you to recount a bit of that here. This was a book that you didn't necessarily think that everybody is going to be interested in, but you had some push from your students that this is something that's going to be very helpful. So tell us how this book got its start.
It began as a course that I developed for later year students at Moore College in Sydney, and the course was called Advanced Topics in Biblical Greek and Exegesis, and it was really, it was an elective with the aim to introduce students to what's going on in the cutting edge of Greek studies. The first year or two of Greek, you're really just covering the basics. First, the basics of grammar in the first year, and then the intermediate level kind of syntax in the second year. And there's really no opportunity in most of our divinity programs, at least, to really dig into some of the interesting and exciting and cutting-edge discussions in Greek scholarship. And the last 30 years has really been a very significant period for Greek scholarship. So a lot has been happening, a lot has been changing. So anyway, that's what the course was for, to introduce students to that, and also to have them try to apply various insights that have come out of those scholarly discussions for exegesis, and exploring discourse analysis and the difference that verbal aspect makes, and deponency in voice and things like that. So I taught that course for a number of years, and after a couple of years of teaching it, some students started to say that they thought I should turn it into a book, and I resisted the idea, and I really didn't think that it would be a book that anyone would be that interested in, and it would be a lot of work, and, I had other projects that I was working on. And so I just kind of said, well, thanks, but no thanks. And the following year, students said the same thing. And this time, if that's happening 2 years in a row, I thought, well, maybe there's something to this. And so I said, why do you think this should be a book? And one student said to me that he felt that if it wasn't for the insights that he'd gained from doing the course, he would have gone on to make exegetical mistakes in his preaching career in the decades to follow. And he was quite serious about that. And I felt pretty much right there and then that was enough justification to attempt turning this material into a book. And so I set about working towards that end.
Well, and as you were working on the book, who was the intended reader that you had in mind? Because I think this is something that's going to be obviously very helpful in the classroom, but there are readers outside of the classroom as well who are going to benefit from this. So who did you have in mind for the book?
Yeah, well, I certainly did have in mind students of the New Testament, anyone studying at a postgraduate level in New Testament studies, but also pastors who use Greek and also New Testament scholars themselves. I've talked to many people in all of those categories over recent years about what's been going on in Greek, and so many of them have expressed a desire to get up to speed, and if only they had the time and the ability to really read and understand the complex monographs and books that are being written at the high end of Greek scholarship. So the book is really aimed at anyone from the student level up who is interested in the study of the New Testament in Greek, the Greek New Testament. And it's really designed to expose them to what's going on and why it matters. That's the intended audience.
Well, and I was just thinking, if there are some potential readers out there who are thinking, man, it's been a long time since I've gotten out my Greek New Testament. It's been a long time since school. You got another little book that might be able to help them get their Greek back in order. Tell us a little bit about Keep Your Greek. I love that little book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that was a book written for similar reasons. People kind of talking to me about, it'd be great if you could put something together to help us keep our Greek over the long term. And I realized that was an important part of teaching Greek, that we need to be helping students to develop strategies so that they don't just forget everything they've learned, but continue to use it and continue even to grow in their knowledge of Greek rather than atrophy. So, yeah, that book, again, written for students, but in particular, people who've been out of seminary for a little while, pastors who, have put in maybe thousands of hours in studying the biblical languages, but so quickly can lose their ability and knowledge just through lack of use and the sheer busyness of other responsibilities. So that little book is really, and it is little, but it's really designed as an encouragement with some practical ideas and some longer-term strategies as to how people who are busy with busy lives can maintain their knowledge of Greek and continue to use it for their study and the teaching of the New Testament.
Well, and I'll say that's, like you said, a very practical little book. I've recommended it to a lot of people. And for the listeners who want to kind of get back on their game with their Greek, it's a very friendly way to jump back in, as you might say. One of the parts of the book I really enjoyed, you give kind of a historical overview of the discipline of Greek study. And in some ways, you could maybe say it's not even all that old of a discipline as far as the last couple hundred years would go. But give us an overview of how did the Greek study as a discipline really begin to develop in the last few hundred years?
That's precisely why I felt that first chapter was important in advances in the study of Greek, because people are generally not that aware of the history of Greek scholarship, and it does affect the conversations we're having now. One of the things that sometimes people say when faced with a paradigm shift in the way, say that we understand verbs with verbal aspects and so on, they'll say something like, well, if we've understood the Greek verb for 2,000 years in this way, why now should we change? And that just reveals the fact that the person saying that is unaware of the history of Greek scholarship. And really, the period that is directly relevant for us now is only, at most, 200 years old. more like 150 years. And all the grammars that people, whoever is alive today, the grammars that they've used to study have been informed by the last 150 to 200 years of scholarship. It doesn't go back beyond that. Of course, Greek was studied before that, and we see a kind of renewal of Greek study in the Renaissance period. But prior to that, there wasn't very much for the 1,000 years prior to that. So, in other words, there's very little in the 2,000 years since the writing of the New Testament that has shaped Greek scholarship that you won't find in the last 200 years, which means that Greek scholarship as we know it is relatively new. And it's certainly not the case that when paradigm shifts come along that you can say, well, this is the way we've understood for 2,000 years. That's just simply not the case. And so that brief history, it is really brief, and there are a lot of significant scholars who are left out. But it's intended to just provide some context for the discussions that follow.
Well, and I think that's helpful because when you're learning Greek at Bible college or seminary, you're not necessarily getting all that much exposure to the history of the study of the language. So at the very least, it'll give you a little framework for how some of that progressed through the years. Next, I think it'd be helpful, give us an overview of some of the different topics that you're covering in the book, and then follow that up with some of the different approaches or ways somebody could use the book.
Well, the first chapter is the one we've been talking about, A Short History of Greek Studies, the 19th century to the present day. And as I said, that's really providing an historical context for the discussions that are happening now. The second chapter is dealing with linguistic theories. The most significant thing to happen to the study of Greek in the last 100 years is the rise of modern linguistics. And that was a really fundamental theoretical change from the 19th century. So the 19th century, the primary way of studying languages was to compare one language to another, and comparative philology, that kind of approach. And that had a number of strengths, but also a number of weaknesses. And modern linguistics was a totally different and new approach, ultimately complementary, I think, to what happened in the 19th century, but radically different in other ways, and providing much more insight into the way languages work for real people. So analyzing Greek through the lens of linguistic theory is a really significant development. But the trouble is, if people don't know the history of Greek scholarship, usually they're even less in touch with linguistics. And that is a very complex and big field with daunting terminology and concepts. So in that chapter, in chapter 2, I'm trying to introduce people to some basic linguistic theory, a little bit of introduction to some of the major schools and camps within linguistics, and some generally agreed upon linguistic principles that will be helpful for people to understand what's happening in Greek scholarship. The third chapter is about lexical semantics and lexicography, and just kind of exploring some of the more recent insights into how to understand what a word means and some of the theory involved in that, and also some discussion about the state of our lexicons like BDAG and Lower NIDA and so on. The fourth chapter is the first place where the book gets a little controversial, I think, discussing deponency and the middle voice. And one of those paradigm shifts I mentioned earlier that is really quite significant is scholars ditching the concept of deponency and seeing that as a Latin imposition on the Greek verbal system. And so that's very current, but I think will quickly catch on because the arguments for that position are very strong in my opinion. But it also involves understanding better what the middle voice is about. In Chapter 5, verbal aspect and Aktionsart is probably the topic that's caused most controversy in recent years, and it has kind of been the dominant topic for discussion in the last 30 years of Greek scholarship. It's also the area where I've done the most work, so that's kind of my area, if you like, and just teasing through some of those discussions. In Chapter 6, idiolect, genre, and register, these are areas that have not been hugely controversial, but there's a lot of potential for future discussion, and talking about the nature of the texts in the New Testament and how the authors of those texts differ from one another linguistically and what we can say about that and how we can analyze those sort of things. And chapters 7 and 8 are dedicated to discourse analysis, and this is a really exciting area for the study of Greek, I think, and very constructive and practical, where people are looking at how Greek language structures and shapes larger units of text, not just looking at the sentence level, which is what traditional grammar has done, but to look at how paragraphs hang together and how wider pericopes have cohesion and those sorts of things. Then chapter 9, the second last chapter, is about pronunciation. And like deponency, there's been a growing movement against the traditional Erasmian way of pronouncing Koine Greek. So sort of introduce readers to that whole discussion, and I advocate a modern Greek pronunciation for Koine Greek. And then finally, chapter 10 is about teaching and learning Greek and just kind of exploring pedagogical insights and advances and issues, including retention, which is where that little book, Keep Your Greek, comes into play a little bit there. So there are 10 chapters, and those are the topics.
Oh, thank you so much for that flyover of the book. As far as how readers might approach the book, would it make sense for them to read it front to back? Can they kind of pick and choose where they dive in? What's going to be most useful?
I think you probably can pick and choose. Most of the chapters are standalone, but chapters 1 and 2 with the history of Greek studies and then linguistic theories are really there to set you up for the following chapters. So I would recommend people read those first, just to get historical context and theoretical context. And then, I think you could fairly freely pick and choose after that.
Another question I had for you as you think back when you were in school and you were learning Greek versus how you approach teaching in the classroom today, what are the most significant changes you see between then and how you're doing things in the classroom now?
Well, I had very good Greek teachers, and, I was really blessed by that, to be honest. And I would say my own teaching style is still heavily influenced by my own Greek teachers. I would say that the main difference is, while Greek as it was taught when I was a student was not disengaged with what's going on. It was engaged, and that's how I kind of got into studying verbal aspect, because it was raised and it was discussed, and I think even we had a couple of days intensive sort of just devoted to verbal aspect, which when I look back on it is pretty extraordinary. And I would say that the main difference for me is I'm sort of a player in that scene. And so when we're talking about verbal aspect, I'm talking about what I've argued in print and in the scholarly discussion versus other people like Stan Porter or Buse Fanning and so on. And so it sort of feels a little weird, I guess, where my own work is part of the subject that we're discussing. And so that means that students are kind of engaged in a different way. They're not just names out there that you read about detached from any sort of personal reality, but they're kind of interested to see how my interaction with these other scholars is panning out and that sort of thing. So that's probably the main difference. And some of those other areas where there have been advances, more up to date perhaps. But that would be the main differences.
Sure, that's helpful. Thank you. So for you, when you think of readers wrapping up, closing the back flap on the book, what does success look like? How would you like to see their study of Greek have been impacted by reading the book?
Well, there are a few things. First, I hope that some of the things that they've read about are immediately applicable. Like my student Nick Moll said in my class a few years ago, there are immediate practical implications. And so I hope that the book itself, in and of itself, will help people to be better and more responsible interpreters of the Greek New Testament. But also, I really hope that readers will finish the book and go, oh, wow, I get what some of these discussions are about, and I feel like I can engage with those now. And so maybe I'll pick up that book by Steve Runge or Stephen Levinson, or maybe I'll just pursue some of the further reading for themselves, but at very least be aware of what's happening so that when future discussions take place, they might be able to listen in, they might be able to engage. And then I guess a third level of outcome would be that some readers would finish the book and say, you know what, I want to do a PhD on deponency in the middle voice. That would be wonderful. So really, just seeing the New Testament Guild, including students, pastors, and scholars, people who are interested in studying the Greek New Testament, just seeing that guild embrace the study of Greek in a more central way than it has been in recent years. That it's not regarded as a kind of peripheral, esoteric area of study, but something that's directly relevant for studying the New Testament.
And has that been a struggle for the Academy or even in the church where people kind of disconnect their language study, say, from their study of the New Testament?
I think so. And partly that's Greek scholarship's fault in the sense that it has largely been highly technical and inaccessible. So even other New Testament scholars who would be interested in knowing what's happening in Greek scholarship are just put off by the kind of inaccessibility of it, and you kind of need to go get another PhD just to engage with the whole topic. So I think partly Greek scholarship has been to blame for that. But also I think the New Testament Guild has maybe fallen for a recent sort of trend or attitude that devalues language. And you see that in the seminaries, that where more and more seminaries are dropping the requirement of Greek, and so you can come out with an MDiv and not have studied Greek. And I think that's a real problem. And, I guess people think, well, you can just read the commentaries and so on, but that's actually not the case, and it doesn't replace reading the New Testament for yourself in Greek and preparing your sermons from the Greek text and so on. So I think overall there's been this sort of just declining interest in the language of the New Testament, and I think that's alarming and it's problematic. And I hope that this book might help to reverse that, at least the attitude that says, I don't need to worry about that. It's simply not true. Language is hugely significant, and frankly, we can't read the Greek New Testament without Greek. So our understanding of Greek really matters for every other area of New Testament study.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think if we think back to when each of us were first learning Greek or Hebrew, we all had those light bulbs going off and those aha moments where all of a sudden the whole world just opened up for you in a new way. And, definitely something that all of our pastors and people who are in ministry really, really will benefit from.
Yeah, it's absolutely the truth. And at the end of the day, I think for theological reasons, people who are professional or vocational Bible teachers need to be engaging with the language of the text, because if we're coming out of Reformation principles that we don't need an external authority to tell us how to know what God's Word says. And I think if everyday pastors all lose their ability to read the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, in the end you are putting scholars in that position of authority and say, well, I don't have access to this information, so I just have to believe whatever the commentary says. And I'm not saying that every pastor needs to be a New Testament scholar themselves in the full kind of professional way, but that they're able to engage the arguments that scholars and commentators make and are able to assess for themselves how strong various arguments are. And you simply can't access those discussions without a knowledge of Greek, at least for New Testament studies. So, I think for theological reasons, it's actually really important for the health of the church.
Definitely agree with you there. A couple of rapid-fire questions here as we begin to wrap up. This is always a dangerous one, and I can't always get a straight answer, but for you, favorite Bible software that you've used or found most helpful through the years?
I've actually used the big three. So for a number of years I used BibleWorks, and my PhD research was all done using BibleWorks, and I found that to be a really powerful and useful tool. But then I switched to Mac, and with that I switched to Accordance, and I still mostly use Accordance, which I love that. It's very intuitive and very powerful. And lately I've been checking out Logos, which has improved a lot. I mean, when I was first looking at the software, I think Logos had a little ways to go, but in recent years they've really beefed it up, and it's quite an impressive software package. But my default still is Accordance at this stage.
Well, it's always fascinating to me. I've got all three of them running on my Mac, so I use each of them for some different things. Also curious, have you done much with manuscript images in the classroom? You know, in Logos and Accordance, we've got amazing high-resolution photos available more and more, especially through the work of organizations like CSNTM. Do you see a place for that in the classroom, or have you done much with that to date?
I haven't done much using the software yet, but I do teach a class on textual criticism and like to use high-res images. But, you know, if they're folded into the software packages, that's all the better. So that's only a good thing in my opinion.
And then last rapid-fire question. You know, a lot of my listeners are building up their libraries. Any thoughts on building up a Greek library as you transition kind of from that college to seminary and beyond?
Good question. You mean after getting my book? I would say...
Of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, quite seriously, one of the functions of the book is to point you to other resources. And so, depending what takes your interest, you know, if you're interested in pursuing discourse analysis, then getting a hold of Runge, getting a hold of Levinson, that would be really useful. I have a respect for the older grammars, but I'm, to be honest, not a huge fan of most of them, except for A.T. Robinson's grammar. And I always say to students, even though it's 100 years old, well, at least since the first edition, that grammar is definitely worth having. And it's often in the software packages, but even if you just pick it up secondhand somewhere, that is a remarkable piece of Greek scholarship that still stands the test of time today, and I still frequently use. So, you know, I would say get Robinson into your library, definitely.
Well, and for the listeners who might want to check some of these authors and books out, I'll be sure to include links in the show notes for this episode, which you'll be able to find at shauntabatt.com. And Con, if the listeners are interested in connecting with you and finding out more about your books, where are some of the places they can find you on the web? I'm
on Twitter, so my Twitter handle is @ConstCampbell. I'm also on Facebook, and I have a website at concampbell.info, so people can connect with me through those avenues.
All right, and I'll be sure to include those in the show notes as well. And it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation today with Constantine Campbell, talking about advances in the study of Greek. For more on Con, you can visit his website at concampbell.info, and be sure to follow him on Twitter, where he goes by the handle @ConstCampbell. For more on the book, you can also check out the publisher's website, which is available at Zondervan.com. Con, just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Shaun. I appreciate being on the show. Thanks for having me.
And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@shauntabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @stabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.